Okay. Sorry we went a little bit over here in the Gompa. Maybe all of you were just fine at home having a few extra minutes, but I based on a conversation I had during the break with Victoria, I just want to talk a little bit about, we use this word confidence in Pasada. And I want to just mention that this is an element that we could relate this to the word faith. We do use the word faith in Buddhism. I mean, faith has a different connotation. When I grew up Catholic, I felt like a lot of my faith was what I might call blind faith. Once more, it could be my own fault. I'm not putting Catholicism down, but it felt like there was this leap of faith I had to make to kind of go from I don't know anything about this to totally believing in it without any real reasoning or proof or anything behind it. And again, that just wasn't suitable to me. And so that's the only reason why I'm bringing it up. In Buddhism, we talk about faith as actually having kind of three dimensions. The very first one is what we call clear faith. And clear faith is what we gain just upon beginning to examine things and sort of understanding with greater clarity how things are or what's going on. It's the initial exposure we often have. And again, all three of these don't happen necessarily in this chronological order, but I usually talk about clear faith as being um, the foundational stuff, where we just gain some confidence, already having some level of confidence just by virtue of knowing what the Buddha taught and beginning to see clearly what that teaching is about. The second level of faith is what we call faith of aspiration, aspirational faith. It's where we then start moving in a direction. It's kind of a bit similar to the Samvega thing a little bit, but it's the idea that we then become motivated to move in a direction that is in line with those teachings. That's another level of faith where we aspire to accomplish what the Buddha taught. The third level of faith is faith of conviction, which kind of becomes closest to what we might call confidence, this word here, where we have actually a conviction in the Buddhist path through our own experience, through our own investigation. So it's not just having clearly seen the teachings and aspired to move in that direction. It's actually the confidence you gain by working with the teachings, by actually seeing the change that can happen in your own mind and in your life on the basis of what the Buddha taught. I think these are equally, again, applicable to other spiritual traditions. I'm not trying to claim that Buddhism by any means has a monopoly on these ideas. But this is something that was different, at least in the way that I approach Catholicism. And it was very refreshing to see that the whole goal was to gain a greater level of confidence on the basis of my own investigation of the truth of these teachings. And that's, again, what we call that faith of conviction or convinced faith. Venerable Urbina, when she talks about, she often uses just the word confidence for faith to begin with. And in fact, the Latin root, con fide, means with faith. There's fide is faith. And so it's not really that different. Confidence means that you've got some faith, some conviction that this is what you want to do with your life. That this is kind of what it all boils down to. And some of us who've been around Buddhism have come to that realization somewhere along the path. That's why we're still here and pursuing this path and doing our practice, whatever. But other people may need to find kind of uh, the newness of that experience and integrate it into their lives. And again, you can do that with regard to any tradition. I think I don't think it necessarily requires that you're Buddhist. But so, any questions on Samvega, Pasada, the five remembrances? Anything else I've talked about so far today or last night? Or even just comments that people want to make. I don't, again, there's wisdom in the room. As we always say, it's not like I'm the only one here that has any information or wisdom to share. So if there's something that you want to share from your own experience that you think is relevant to what we talked about, by all means. We have an invitation for that right now before we go on to the next topic. Anyone? Yes, please. Suhas.
It's just more of a thought that the eight concerns, the worldly concerns, and it's sort of the like one of them, or maybe if you also add that the temporal or the time dimension to it, I mean, what I see, when for myself, people around me, especially that uh, comfort in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And I just the thought came to me, and especially in this topic, the death and the uncertainty around it. It's like what if I live another 50 years? Oh my God, what about the health insurance? So I better work now so that I'm comfortable at
Uh-huh.
some date in the future.
Uh-huh.
And then that, so now your day-to-day living is about, securing some comfort in the future,
Hmm.
which may or may not happen. And it it's something that it's very, everyone has. I mean, that's a fear.
Hmm.
You see nowadays, I mean, that's like, people, they don't want to stop working because they don't want, I mean, like for instance, we're having conversation with my colleagues, and they're worried about that. And I said, if we in the Bay Area, which is like the top 0.1%, in terms of the overall wealth, are worried, then it's hopeless for the rest of the world. Just a thought came to my mind, but anyway, that I just thought I
Sure.
would bring it up and see if you have anything to sort of,
Hmm.
elaborate on that.
I mean, you bring up a really good point, Sauce, because again, we don't want to deny that we have to be concerned about the future to some degree. I mean, I talked earlier about kind of every day just being present with that day and what have you. But we do have some need for some regard for what comes after. That's the whole point as well of the Buddhist teachings, and not going just to later in this life, how long will I live? What sorts of insurance or savings will I need to make my life comfortable then? But rather even what is my next life? What is it beyond my next life? Those sorts of future concerns are not completely foreign to Buddhism either. But it's just a matter of once more, where do we put all of our attention? And while we are having some sort of concern for this, is it because we want to accomplish spiritual goals, or is it because we want to be able to do more things on our bucket list and get all over the world and whatever more comfortably or whatever? So I think it always once more comes back down to what is our underwriting motivation for these things. I mean, a similar example, maybe in some ways, when I was studying in Italy, even though we were living just a few miles away from the Mediterranean Sea, I wasn't on a Mediterranean diet per se. The food at the center was actually not that nutritious. It was a lot of carbohydrates and things. And my all of my blood work was crazy when I went back to the US. It was actually my father's doctor who saw me, and he said, if you don't change things, you're going to end up just like your father. You're going to have diabetes, and you're going to have heart issues, all of these things because of how my blood work was. So I said, okay, thank you for that warning. And I changed everything. I went back there, actually started making my own food back in the program because the food they were making just really wasn't doing the trick. So I put a lot of effort into doing that. But once more, what was my motivation? Is my motivation simply about grasping at this life and the comforts of this life, the eight worldly concerns? Or is my motivation because I want to make sure that while I have this human life, and while I've used this life as best as I can to acquire Dharma knowledge and to work with it and so on, that I make the best use of this life by having even more years of this life? Then that's a very different motivation, right? So I think with any of these things, whether you're looking at, yeah, what do you need in the future to be comfortable later on in this life, or to make sure you take care of yourself so you can have that, why do you want that? Why do you want to have that? Look at always at that motivation. And if it's so that you can make sure that you use this life well, meaningfully, being of service to others and helping, yourself to move further on the path, well, there's nothing wrong with that then. We have to just watch that mind of attachment that can creep in there too. That's really just about ourselves and what we want, not so much about the needs of others. So I think that's an important part of it. By the way, one of these things I realized when you were talking, when you brought up fear, that one thing I didn't mention last night is, remember that when we use the word fear, that fear has other different dimensions to it as well. Lama Zopa Rinpoche even wrote a book on death called Wholesome Fear. Some of our fear is actually really useful for us. Like that fear that was instilled in me by my father's doctor saying, guess what? Your blood work looks so lousy that you're going to end up dying early. My father died at 70. I'm only 4 years away from that right now. So, thinking about being 4 years away from my death, maybe I'm less than that, who knows? But the reality is there's something that happened in me that spurred some sort of a fear that became more wholesome by virtue of saying, okay, what do I do to address this? And how do I rectify this so that I can have a longer life potentially and be able to use this life well? So fear in and of itself isn't necessarily negative. Really depends upon what's going on. It can become we might get very obsessed with our fear and it might become somewhat neurotic. And then that's not very useful, right? If I just sit there, you take this course with me on death, and then all you do is spend every night being unable to sleep and, worrying that, you're going to die the next day. And oh my God, how do I live my life with this knowledge? And I mean, that's not good, right? But that's a neurotic fear. That's using that fear in the wrong way. The fear can be quite wholesome because we go, okay, death is going to come. That means I've got to pay attention to what I'm doing with my life, and I need to prepare for my death. As I said, those are the two main things we're striving to achieve in this weekend. So don't let it become a neurotic fear, an unwholesome fear. Let it become something that is really useful. So I just wanted to bring that up as well, because when you were talking about fear, I was like, okay, yeah, I also might need to talk about that. And my example does clarify that to some degree. There are many ways that we use fear. Even if you look at the Lam Rim, those stages of the path teachings, fear is brought up quite a bit. Fear of ending up in an animal realm or other realms that are lower states, fear of continuing to go from life to life, all these sorts of fears, even fears of other people having to suffer. These can be ways that we can see fear that can actually be really constructive for us because they wake us up to what could potentially be going on that we need to address. Nothing wrong with fear in that context. So, okay. Yeah, great. Nick, yeah, if you wouldn't mind unmuting, I think we'll be able to get you on the speakers here and everything. Thanks for putting your hand up.
Oh, sure. Well, what I want to say is that I have been practicing almost 40 years. I took the Bodhisattva vow 35 years ago. And recently, I mean, within a matter of the past few months, uh, I have not only gotten over any fear of death, I am welcoming it and I am looking forward to it. And I was surprised by this, but at first, but now it actually gives me joy. The other thing that happened I never expected could happen was that at the same time, I feel a true non-attachment to
Mm,
all those who I love, including people in my family, my wife, children, and my granddaughter. And I don't know why I mentioned that. I guess the only reason I mention that is that I am kind of surprised by arriving at this point. I'm not exactly sure why or how it happened now,
mm,
but I wanted to know, as I really want to be prepared at death, if there are specific death time practices. I mean, assuming I am in bed knowing I'm going to die, that I should practice at that time and how I can prepare now
mhm.
to get used to practicing those things.
Sure. No, it's a very good question, Nick, and thank you for sharing. And yeah, I've been in touch somewhat with Nick, so I know some of his story and where he's at. But it's great. I mean, this is an example of what long-term dedicated practice does, is that it really does help us to be in a different place in terms of how we relate to our lives and the world around us. Again, doesn't mean that he doesn't value those things, but has that.
May I? I'm sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt. The other thing that I wanted to say is that I have a completely different perception of physical reality, which I think to most people on the planet is something that sounds insane. And
Mm,
that is that I have a stronger inner sense of confidence that spiritual reality is more real than physical reality. I
mm,
don't know what that means.
mm,
I
mm,
don't know what you'd say about that,
mm,
except I just felt I should bring that up.
right. Right. No, I appreciate that comment too, because I think, again, these are all indicators of what dedicated practice can do and can change, again, the way that we're looking at our worlds and the beings in it, lessen our attachment, give us more confidence in our spiritual practice and the spiritual reality that you're speaking to. In terms of practices or things that we want to do at the time of death, Lama Zopa Rinpoche gives a number of things that are more
Mhm.
complicated practices and things that involve various visualizations and mantra recitations and things. But when you boil it all down, they say, of course, the most important thing at the time of death is that we have as virtuous of a state of mind as possible. Now, what is the most virtuous state of mind that we can have? Well, certainly, I mean, if you can have some wisdom of emptiness, which is a pretty highfalutin concept that we, can get to through deeper investigation, but at least to have what we call bodhicitta. Bodhicitta in the Mahayana tradition is the wish to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings. It's motivated by compassion and loving kindness towards those beings, which are also, of course, very powerful positive states of mind. In many of the instructions that are given in our tradition, they say that relying upon the mind of bodhicitta at the time of death is really very powerful because it keeps the energy going into our next life in terms of being able to be dedicated to relieving the suffering of all beings, which of course is also including us, to change our own fundamental situation from being unenlightened to being enlightened. So if I had to boil it down, I mean, I could talk about many other different practices that Rinpoche would encourage people to be familiar with at the time of death. Bodhicitta is really key. I think Rinpoche, if he were here, he might agree to that. I think he gives a lot of emphasis to that. So then, how do we make sure that that's a state of mind at death? Well, it's like anything, we have to become familiar with it. They say that if we are more familiar with this mind and we cause it to arise again and again throughout our lives, then it'll be much more natural for it to arise at the time of our death. You know? So bodhicitta is a mind that is cultivated. In our tradition, there are two main techniques, and I won't go into all the details of it. I'm just going to introduce these. One is what's called the sevenfold cause and effect, where we start with a foundation of equanimity towards all beings, and we generate different thoughts that cause us to think of them in a very close way and generate loving kindness and compassion for them, and then funnel that into a mind that wishes to benefit them, to lead them to freedom from suffering, lead them to their ultimate happiness. And then there's a second technique called equalizing and exchanging self and others. Both of these are taught in what we call the Lam Rim books. Um, Lama Tsongkhapa's great treatise is the most extensive way of approaching the Lam Rim, but there are also other Lam Rim books where they go into detail on these. And so you engage in either of these techniques or even combine them together. There's a way to do that. And you practice uh, those meditations day in and day out. Again, this is what we call kind of our analytical meditations in Tibetan Buddhism. Meditation in Tibetan Buddhism has two main flavors. One is the stabilizing meditation, where we are making the mind single pointedly focused. This results in what we call calm abiding, a mind that can remain single pointedly on whatever object we wish. But then we introduce analytical meditations as well, where we are actually investigating the teachings and cultivating different mind states and so on. And bodhicitta is one of those analytical meditations. So we use these two in tandem. We develop the single pointedness of the mind, calm abiding, and so on. And then we, on the basis of that, or even before that, it's not that you have to wait for that, but if you have that, then you can investigate the teachings with so much more power because you can actually remain single pointedly focused on what you are investigating. And you bring those two together into what we call a union of calm abiding and special insight or analysis. And that's how we change our minds. And that's how we become familiar with these so that when death comes, we are naturally able to bring those states of mind to the forefront. Because we'll be resting in the mind of bodhicitta in spite of what is all going on around us. Now, again, these great meditators who are more familiar with the wisdom of emptiness or even with tantric practices can use the time of death in a very powerful way to actualize realizations all the way to Buddhahood at the time of death, depending upon their practice, their familiarity. So everything comes down to familiarity with these concepts. Even to die with a mind of compassion for beings, which is, again, a meditation within those techniques of developing bodhicitta. That's very powerful. A mind that's thinking of others. To die with the practice of Tonglen, which is part of the technique of equalizing and exchanging self and others, where as we breathe in, we're breathing in all the suffering of beings. As we breathe out, we're giving them all of our happiness. That's a powerful way to die. So there are again techniques, things within each of these techniques that we could also be quite focused on. Even if we don't get quite to the point of bodhicitta, you can develop some skill and ability so that at the time of death, that mind will more naturally arise. Can't wait till death to practice it because it's too late then again, we don't have the wherewithal to necessarily bring those thoughts to mind in a really strong way. So that's my basic advice. And I'm sure we can probably work together, to come up with more things around, preparing for death. Just know that also at the FPMT's website, there's quite a section on practices around the time of death that we can do ourselves or that we can even do for others who have died. But I hope that helps some, Nick. But thank you for sharing.
Yeah, yeah, it does. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, Russ has something to say here. Do we have the microphone? Is yeah, right there. Great.
I've heard that at the time of death, our bodies are so used to living that we don't understand that we are dying.
Mm-hmm.
So we should question, am I dying?
Mm-hmm.
And then start preparing our minds for the death process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be, even mentally, you talk about physically, our bodies not being sort of ready for death, but I think mentally, even to the degree that we prepared, of course, has a bearing on this. But they say that there's even a very subtle level of like grasping at existence that occurs at the time of death, that we just don't want to let go of this life that we have, and that may be some of it coming from our bodies being sort of, I don't know, conditioned to in that way, but our minds really grasping at this as being us, as being me, and we feel a sense of annihilation when we're having to sort of separate from all of that. That's why, again, one of the things that we're going to touch on tomorrow when we go through very briefly the actual death process is you can practice that. In fact, in the tantric teachings, in highest yoga tantra in particular, that's part of a daily practice, is to go through the stages of death and to imagine what it's like to have the mind get subtler and subtler and to eventually be no longer kind of in an embodied form and then to go into the intermediate state and then to go on to one's next rebirth. That's part of a good practice. So that once more, it comes down to exactly how I answered Nick's question. The degree to which we have practiced these sorts of things is a degree to which we can bring them to mind at the time of death. Hopefully, we have a gradual death where we can actually utilize this. If you have a very sudden death, well, then everything, happens very quickly and you won't have much ability to use your meditative skill at that time. But hopefully we'll have the opportunity, to actually bring these things to mind. So to what you're saying, Russ, yeah, I mean, we might have certainly some level of conditioning that's going to make it very hard to let go of this life and have the process kind of see itself through. One thing, the process is going to happen whether we're ready for it or not, but we can prepare by having those sorts of meditations, because you don't have to be a highest yoga tantra practitioner to practice observing the death process. That's perfectly fine for anyone to do and to prepare themselves by knowing to some degree what's going to happen at death. I'll go into that tomorrow. Again, it's sort of an unfolding of grosser levels of awareness down to very, very subtle states, all the way to the subtlest state of mind. That's sort of at the basis of our consciousness. So does that help a little bit, address it a little bit? Yeah. But yeah, it is interesting. We live our whole lives together with this body, that this relationship of our mind and body becomes really quite tight. This is how we even identify others, right? We go, oh, there's Victoria. We don't even know minds. There's a mind there, but we're mostly identifying with the physical body, and even ourselves. That's how we tend to see ourselves. I'm this physical body. Again, that gets into that deeper investigation of what is the real I, which is the investigation that leads us to seeing emptiness. But if you can be aware of emptiness at the time of death, well, then that will hopefully loosen any attachment to the body or the mind being the I, and we'll be able to die with a much greater wisdom than what we're living with, perhaps. But that also, again, takes familiarity. If you're not familiar with these things, it's ridiculous to try to think that you're going to bring them up at the time of death. There's a wonderful phrase that comes from some Greek, can't remember who it was. I saw it in a book by Kazuhaga called Resisting Violence. I think it's called Healing Resistance. I'm sorry, Healing Resistance. It's a book about nonviolence. It's called Healing Resistance. He says, this quote from this Greek guy says, "We don't rise to the level of our aspirations. We fall to the level of our training." he said he, heard that in the context of martial arts when he was practicing martial arts, but it's true in regard to Buddhism. We don't have these great aspirations that, oh, on my deathbed, I'm going to be this magnificent, wonderful, peaceful being, and I'm just going to have all these great thoughts, and it's all going to be, hunky dory. That's a nice aspiration, but you're going to fall to the level of your training when death actually happens, which means the degree to which you have trained in focusing the mind and being able to stay present with these thoughts and cultivate these wholesome attitudes and so on. That's what you're going to be able to rely upon, not an aspiration that, oh, I'm going to be this magnificent, calm, focused, warm-hearted being at my death. If you haven't been that throughout your life, good luck. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be so cynical. But that's what they all say, this is what it comes down to. We have to be realistic, exactly. Okay, any other questions or comments before we go on to our next topic? Okay, so this is where we start getting into, again, this is a more traditional Tibetan Buddhist way of looking at death awareness. The 5 remembrances, again, are taught in the Pali tradition. But Larry Rosenberg, nonetheless, teaches this 9-point death awareness meditation as well, because we live in a time, this is where when we talk about different Buddhist traditions, it's impossible for us to know exactly to what degree anybody's practicing anything that's really exclusive, because everything has gotten much more intermingled in our modern age. You often have like monks from the Pali tradition sitting in the front rows of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's teachings, right? So you have people that are from a tradition that's not necessarily deemed Mahayana that are getting teachings in the Mahayana, but what they're practicing, who we don't know. I mean, these great monks of these various traditions could actually be bodhisattvas or Buddhas for all that we know, or really quite enlightened, advanced beings. So this is a tradition that comes from Lama Atisha and his teachings that he brought into Tibet about 1,000 years ago. Again, this whole stages of the path, Lamrim teachings, have quite a history. But when Lama Atisha came to Tibet, the Tibetans asked him specifically for a way of working with the Dharma, because the Dharma had been there a few centuries, but it seemed like it had gotten a bit muddied and people weren't really sure, where do you enter, where do you go to, how do you move through things? And so Lama Atisha came up with this very wonderful structure of the Lamrim. And I'm not going to go into a whole thing about that. That is one of the gems I find of this tradition that we're involved with here with this center, is that it sets out very clearly a path that you take gradually, meditating on this, meditating on that, everything built upon what preceded it. So as I mentioned this earlier today, the very first topic of the first of the 3 levels of the stages of the path is death and impermanence. And so Lama Atisha gave us this particular way of focusing on death that is called the death awareness meditation, or 9-point death awareness meditation. In it, there are 3 main kind of ideas we want to get across. I'm going to introduce you to those before we go into more detail on them. The very first one is, it sounds a little ridiculous because nobody would deny that they're going to die, but we have to develop first that certainty that our death is going to happen. The certainty of death. That's got 3 points within it. We'll go into those shortly. Then we have the second point, which is the one I mentioned earlier today, which is the one that Lama Tsongkhapa says is the most important. That's that the time of death is uncertain. So while it is absolutely definite and certain that we're going to die, it is absolutely uncertain when that's going to happen. So we've been talking about already today, it could happen today. We all think that during the lunch break, we're going to be able to leave here. Oh, I'm sorry, there's not a lunch break, but when we go to lunch after this, we go, to lunch, that we're going to be able to have our lunch, go home, do whatever we have planned for the day, all of that. But we may not get a chance to do that. I mean, it really may happen. People die on accidents and what have you all the time. It hasn't happened to us yet, knock on wood, be grateful that it hasn't, because we still have a continuation of this human life. But there's no guarantee. That's the second set. The third set of contemplations have to do with the fact that regardless of when death comes, the amount of time that we actually have to practice Dharma, to do things with our minds, and according to the Buddha's teachings, is really quite limited. I'm sorry, that's not the third one. That's a third of that one. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. Erase that. can go back and edit that out. The third one, sorry, I got my wires crossed there. The third one is that when death comes, when we actually have the experience of death, we find that the only thing we can rely upon is our spiritual practice. Sorry, I don't know why I jumped ahead to that third point within the second one. These get a little complicated. Okay, so three main points. Death is absolutely certain it's going to happen, uncertain when it's going to happen, and when it does happen, what is going to be most useful is what we've done with our minds. Everything else will be really not that useful at all. Okay, sorry about that. Didn't mean to get you all confused. Let's go ahead and put on the screen, I think there's a little quote that I added about these death awareness meditation, and then we'll go on into actually looking at these. This is from the Buddha again, from the Mahayana Mahaparinirvana Sutra. Of all footprints on this planet, the elephant's footprint is supreme, right? It's the largest, it's the most, makes the biggest impression. Of all perceptions, remembering death and impermanence is supreme. Excuse me just a moment. So again, death and impermanence is that very first topic of the Lam Rim because of this, because it can have the biggest effect on our spiritual practice. Just like the biggest footprint is the elephant's, by meditating on death and impermanence, it can become the platform from which we have samvega and pasada. We have, a desire to use this life well and to have that confidence that we can do that and attain actual results from that. So again, that is what we are meaning by this quote, that the Buddha is giving us this advice to remember death. And that's why Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, again, we should do that every day. We should remember that we are going to die and potentially that day could be our very last day. So the root proposition, the very first of these three, is death is certain. There are three reasons that are given here. And again, these are technically not reasons. As I said, that third one is the one that I started bringing up. That's the third of the first one. I don't know where that came from. I really apologize. Sometimes I get kind of ahead of myself on my thinking. We have the very first of these three reasons behind this root proposition. First, death will definitely come and nothing can prevent it. As I said, this isn't earth-shaking. If you ask anybody on the street, are you going to die? They'll say, well, yeah, of course we all die, right? They get it at a kind of a very basic intellectual level. The problem is, do we really live our lives with that awareness? This first one, that death is inevitable for every single one of us, is a really powerful meditation because it brings that into our focus in a way that we cannot deny the reality of death. What it does is and the way that you're often encouraged to meditate on that first one, is to start with looking back on history, and acknowledging the various people of the past who are now all dead, even great spiritual leaders. You can certainly start with, Charlemagne, and all these great figures of the past that are in our history books when we study history in school. All these various, figures from the East, figures from the West, figures from wherever. They all have died. Even our great spiritual leaders. Jesus Christ died. The Buddha died. The Buddha had his death at around 80 years old, right? Every being who is born dies. And you start with that, things that are kind of distant from us. Again, historical figures, what have you. Then you bring it into this life. In this life, we've all known people who have died. Many of us have lost parents. Many of us have lost other people, friends in our lives. Many of us have gone through very painful experiences of losing people in our lives. But we can recall that those people too were subject to death. Just as these great figures of the past or historical figures have all died, so too everyone in our lives who has died already has had that happen to them. Then think about the fact that everyone who's in your life right now is also going to die. That kind of brings it home because then we also maybe even begin to get some of that recognition that we're going to lose those folks potentially. They might die before we do, or we might die and have to leave them behind, but they are all subject to death as well. Every single being that we know right now is going to die. And then we finally tighten it all the way to ourselves. Then it kind of lands where else can it go? We've looked at all these beings from the past, all these beings that we've known in this life, the beings that we currently know, well, it rests right in our own situation. We ourselves are subject to death. Can't escape that fact. Again, that book, there was a book that was written about Jim Morrison and saying, no one gets out of here alive, I think it was called. And none of us do. So that's a way of meditating on this. Of course, certainly during our daily life, we can also bring to mind things like going to the obituaries. It's healthy to read the obituaries. Some people might think it's morbid, but again, we're looking at death in terms of reminding us that that's a reality for us. One day we're going to be an obituary. We're going to be on the internet or in a newspaper or something listing out what we did with our lives with our beginning date and our end date. And all of that's going to happen to us. I remember when I told Venerable Rabina about how one of her students in Santa Fe had passed away, she wrote back and she said, every time I hear this news about somebody dying, all I think is someday that will be me. Someday you'll be the one that they're writing emails about saying, oh, Casey died. Oh, Bay died. Oh, whoever died, right? We're going to definitely be the subject of that email at some point. This is going to happen to us. There's even a really interesting text called, it was originally published as Heart Spoon. Can't remember what they republished it as, the FPMT. It was written by Pabanka Rinpoche, this great the teacher of the Lam Rim. We have Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand, that is his teachings on that. But this book it was originally published as Heart Spoon. And it's a really wonderful meditation on the refrain that you get to at the end of each line is, this is going to happen to me. And we talk about the death process and being there and being surrounded by your loved ones and having to say goodbye. This is going to happen to me. All of these things are going to happen to you. So this is a powerful way to do that. Larry Rosenberg, in his book, he uses maybe a more entertaining exercise. He watches old movies, he says. Put on one of those old black and white films from like the 1930s or 1920s even or something. I mean, there's really kind of a lot of old films out there. Put on something that, again, those were all people generally in their adult years, or at least young adult years. And he says, you can watch it and they all seem so alive and so full of, energy and what have you. And without a doubt, they're all dead now. The actresses and actors are dead. The producers and directors are dead. The camera people are dead. Probably everyone involved in a film from the 1930s is dead now, right? Because here we are in the 2020s. We are 90 years from that, and most of them were adults at that time. It can be kind of an interesting exercise, but find what works for you to remind you of this fact that everyone dies, and that includes me. That's the important point, is when we're watching the films or something, don't think it's just about all them and they've all had to die, but I'm immune. Just bring it home to roost, make sure that we recall that. There are probably other creative ways that you can recall that, but it's worthwhile to just meditate on it in the way that I said, bringing it home by thinking about all the other beings that have had to die, even these great spiritual masters, and that we can't prevent our own death. It will come regardless. Number 2 is a really interesting one too. I find this one really the most powerful of the 3 in this set, that our lifespan cannot be increased, but rather it decreases continuously. Now, as I said, the second root proposition that we're going to get to next is about the uncertainty of the time of death. And admittedly, that we don't know. But we do know that death is going to happen at some point. So we can't say how many moments we have between now and when death comes, but we can say that those moments diminish second by second as we continue to live. Every moment that we live is one moment closer to death. Everyone agree? So there are different ways of meditating on this. I mean, you can do this simply by observing your own breath, or if you can pay attention to your heartbeat, maybe, put your hand over your heart or get at your pulse or something. Every heartbeat is one heartbeat closer to death. Every breath is one breath closer to death. That's one less breath that I have in this life. Again, can be pretty powerful just to work with those kind of things that are so much about our being alive, right? Having our heart continue to beat, having us continue to breathe. All of that will stop at some point when we have death. Well, every moment, one heartbeat closer to death, one breath closer to death. But you can also use some really creative ways of meditating on this, focusing on this. The one that I like to do is to think of an hourglass with a lot of sand in it. Maybe it's bigger than the one in the Wizard of Oz, right? You know, it's quite a big hourglass, but we have all these grains that at the moment of our conception, we could say even is the beginning of this life in Buddhist terms, and to some degree, physiologically, that's true, right? We have the grains of sand start to come through that little hole into the bottom chamber, right? And it's continuous. The grains of sand are continuously coming through moment by moment. There's going to be a point where there are no more grains of sand left in the upper chamber. It's just that occurs. That's death. We don't know how many grains of sand are remaining, but that's the process we're involved in, is those grains continually coming through that little opening, going into the lower chamber, having been spent. Every moment, just another moment gone, another moment gone. And can be very powerful. I think the one some teachers use is the idea of a train going from point A to B, how it's on tracks that are continually getting closer and closer to the destination. But find what works for you. Again, this one you can be very creative with. And you might just want to focus on the breath or the heartbeat and be really kind of with the physicality of this body and recognizing this body is going to cease to sustain your consciousness at some point. But meditate on that reality that every moment we're another moment closer to death, another moment closer to death. You know, in the course of a day, we exhaust a day, we're another day closer to death, one less day in this life. I find this one really powerful because it kind of wakes you up to what am I doing with this day then? Which again is not necessarily the import of this meditation yet. All of these are to get us to a place where, as I said, to use our life wisely, to make sure that we're prepared for death. But really what we're talking about here is to have this hit home that death is part of our continuum that continues to get closer and closer and closer. We don't know that gap. That's the next set of meditations, but we can acknowledge that this is going to happen in that way. Anyone have any comments on that one or anything? Some of you do this meditation, maybe something that you use. Anyone? Trying to think there was another one. Can't remember what that one was, but again, whatever works for you. The whole point is to kind of bring this into our minds in a very deep way, that we are continually getting closer and closer to death. And we can't increase it. I do want to talk about that a little bit. It says you cannot be increased. I mean, in Tibetan Buddhism, they sometimes do these long life pujas, long life empowerments, what have you, where kind of invoking some sort of energies to help you to live longer. The understanding that I have is that sort of the duration of this life is sort of karmically determined for you in terms of if things all proceed as planned, you would live so long, you know, so, and to some degree we can say that's part of our genetics, but your genetics are also karmically determined. But that is sort of a given. Now, we don't know what that is, obviously, but there can be accidental death. There can be things that interrupt that life. When you do those sorts of long life pujas, that's what you're actually creating a force to hopefully keep those things at bay so you don't have to experience a shortening of this life from what you would normally live based on the karmic imprints that cause this life. So you can't really ever increase the life. You can only avoid things that are going to cut your life short. So we only have so much time we can spend in this life. Now, and when you get into some of the tantric practices, they do say that you can attain much longer lives through some of that. So it's not to say that there aren't techniques for elongating our lives, but generally speaking, for everyday person on the street, this is not possible. You know? We're coming to our death closer and closer every moment. So I just do want to point that out because some of you might say, well, what about long life practices and all that? Doesn't necessarily work in terms of curtailing our death beyond what we would normally be able to live in this life. Number 3 is the one that, again, I'm sorry I mentioned that out of turn. Death will certainly come regardless of whether you have made time to practice Dharma or not. This one isn't technically a reason for why death is certain, but it's an implication or an inference that we can have on the basis of death being certain, is that because death is certain, you have to be attentive with what you do with this life, because death is going to come regardless of whether you've practiced or not. That's why every day becomes very precious, even at this point of recognizing the certainty of death, much less the second point of the uncertainty of the time of death, because we recognize that with the certainty of death coming, you're not going to be able to say, oh, wait, death's coming. Would you mind if I do some mantras and things right now, make sure I've got some good mojo for the next life? You have to face death whenever it happens. And if we look at our lives, the amount of time that we actually spend in what we would call really meaningful and purposeful Dharma practice might be actually quite limited. So what they encourage you to do in this meditation is to even examine the course of a day. So let's say, you get up at whatever time, 6, 5, I don't know what time people get up, 7, 8, whatever. It doesn't matter to me what time you get up, but look at what you do from the time you get up until the time you go to bed. And of course, you have that block of time when you're asleep. Kind of hard to practice when you're asleep. They do say there are certain things, thoughts we might want to introduce as we go into sleep that could be really useful, making our sleep maybe a bit more virtuous. But a block of our day is already consumed with sleep. By the time when we get up until we go to bed, what portion of our day is spent in various activities? Like going to work, like eating food, preparing food, shopping for food. We have a lot of things around food. What part of our day is spent being with friends, getting together for coffee or whatever, talking to them, texting with them on your phone? What part of our day is involved in other social activities or in entertainment? Maybe you spend part of your day with Netflix or whoever, you like to watch. What part of our day is spent, taking care of our bodies, exercising and what have you? We have a lot of different parts of our day that we do all these various things. And we can say that you can make some of those things spiritual practice. I was talking about that earlier in regard to the question, is it possible to do some of these things with a more spiritual mind? Absolutely. But most of us just go through these activities in our day without much awareness about them. Oh, just going to go do this and go do that and go do this and go do that. And how much have we really practiced the Dharma? Once more, what does it mean to practice the Dharma or to have a spiritual practice? It means to work on our mind, to reduce our negative tendencies and to increase our positive ones. That's in a nutshell, again, what Buddhism's all about. There's a lot of other teachings we feed into that are a part of creating positive states of mind, good understanding of what the Buddha taught. So, some portion of study and meditation and practice is good to do every day. But even when we're not doing those formal things, maybe you do have an hour and a half, 2 hours. I don't know how much time you spend in a formal dedicated practice, maybe less than that. That's only one small part of your day. To what degree are you bringing the Dharma to mind in your other activities? So if we look at it just time-wise, it's obvious that we probably don't spend that much time in really formal dedicated practice. A good chunk of our day might not be dedicated for that at all. But we can have some influence on the rest of our day by at least bringing the Dharma to mind and trying to practice according to what the Buddha taught as we talk to other people, as we do our work, and so on. But the meditation here is that a good chunk of our day is not going to be spent doing Dharma practice. And if you're not familiar with it, again, through the time we do spend in meditation and what have you, then it's kind of hopeless because we get caught up in those worldly concerns. We just do things by rote and we don't really have much power over our minds. So that's the third meditation, is to really look at it and say, okay, given that my death is certain, it's going to come, what am I doing with my time? And if we find that we're spending 90% of our day engaged in a whole lot of other stuff that's somewhat meaningless, again, we do have to work, we do have to do these things, but we're not even engaging our mind when we're doing that in terms of more wholesome thoughts, well then, we're wasting a lot of time, and death is going to come without giving us extra time. It's going to say again, oh, you can have another day to do all the Dharma practice you want to do. We should be doing what we can now. So I think it is important that we distinguish, Dharma practice, meaning what people often refer to as practice as the more formal elements of reciting various practices and things. Those are good to do, don't get me wrong. But we really have to pay attention to what it means to practice Dharma every day and every moment of our lives if we can, to try to have more awareness, more mindfulness, be able to bring into our awareness the thoughts that we want to cultivate. So as in answer to Nick's question, when we get to death, we're familiar with all of those things, because we've been practicing them throughout our day. So as a footnote to this, because again, the main part of this, the gist of this meditation is to come to the conclusion, wow, I'm really not spending that much time practicing Dharma. Well, one answer to that is learn how to practice the Dharma skillfully throughout your day. Lama Zopa Rinpoche has this really wonderful practice, sets of practices that is in a little booklet called, I think it's the title is something like Cultivating Bodhicitta Mindfulness. At least Bodhicitta Mindfulness is part of it. I talked about bodhicitta earlier in response to Nick's question. It's the most positive state of mind we can have. So what Rinpoche did is he went back to Buddhist sutras, Mahayana sutras, and he found a number of ways that the Buddha says that you can reframe how you're looking at just mundane activities. You know, like if you're cutting up vegetables for dinner, you can think that you're cutting through the ignorance of all beings. You know, it doesn't change the act. You're still going to get your cut vegetables that you can put in your soup or stir fry or whatever it is that you're doing with those. But you're going to transform that activity into one where you're thinking about benefiting other beings. That's part of bodhicitta, that we want to be able to cut their ignorance, the root of ignorance. It's keeping them in samsara. So as we cut our vegetables, we do that. Or as you turn on a light when you go into a room, we all do that many times in a day, right? As you turn on that light, you hold the thought that you're enlightening all beings, bringing them the light of wisdom through that simple act of turning on a light. You know, you can do all of these things. It's a wonderful little booklet. I won't go into the whole extent of them, but begin to practice just one or two of these. The really interesting one is when you go to the bathroom, you know, when you sit on the toilet or stand at the toilet, depending on who gender and what you're doing. But anyway, when you're excreting, think that you're removing all of the negativities of all beings, all of their negative karma, all of their, you know, deluded minds, their jealousy, their pride, their anger, ignorance. And of course, as you flush it, think it's all going away, so it'll never recur again in those beings. It changes the way you go to the bathroom. Right? I mean, that's in there. It's in the booklet. I mean, these are wonderful things that Rinpoche's done in collecting this advice, because otherwise we're just robotic in what we do. Every day we just, oh, I do this and I do that and I do this and I do that, and we don't think about what we're doing in any different way. Well, why not make it into something positive? What's the problem with that? There's no problem. It's actually taking advantage of a portion of our day when we're engaged in a lot of activities that are relatively neutral. They're not probably non-virtuous, but they're relatively neutral. We just go through them and don't take advantage of them. So I can't help but bring that up when we're talking about this subject of, you know, how much of our day is spent in Dharma practice. You can practice a Dharma doing many other things. You can practice changing your mind in regard to doing other things. It sounds a little silly, but it's actually how it works. If every time we do these activities, we think about benefiting others, well, then you're thinking about benefiting others a lot. Right? And that's the whole goal. We want to be able to think about these things as often as possible. So let's go back to the slide. We've got a root conclusion, or a kind of a main drive that we are going to, a resolution, as it said here. Can you call these a conclusion or resolution? The very first resolution is that death is definite. We've gotten to that conclusion. Therefore, I must practice Dharma. Because we have a limit in regard to this life, death is going to come and end this wonderful life that we have right now with this human intellect and everything. Because that's going to happen, we have to use this life meaningfully. We have to practice Dharma. So this is, again, a very powerful meditation, even though, once more, anyone on the street would say, absolutely, they're going to die. Have we really brought it into our awareness? It means I have to do something now while I have this life. This life has got to be used to practice Dharma. All right. Let me see if there are any questions on that before we go on to introduce the next one. We don't have tons of time, but we may be able to go through the next one, the next set. Anyone? Online? All right. So again, that's one full meditation in and of itself. And each one of these points you could meditate on for quite some time. So know that this death awareness meditation you can do, as Kinnan would say, and you could do it in your morning and go through all of the points, but you could even also break it up over the course of 9 days. You might go through each point, one each day, and that way really take it deeply and really analyze. Once more, I want to mention, while we're talking about meditation, I mentioned this earlier about we've got our stabilizing meditation and our analytical meditation. The way we bring these two together is when we stabilize the mind to some degree, by focusing on the breath like we did at the beginning of today, or whatever technique you use to stabilize what you meditate on. Then you introduce some analysis. You look at these points, such as the first point, that it's absolutely certain that death will come for me, that there are no exceptions, whatever. You look at all the points there, meditate on it in the way that you do. When you get to that place where you've Venerable Rabina would say when the penny drops. I don't know where that comes from. It might be a British phrase, but the idea is when it hits home, when we get to that place, we go, okay, I get it. I'm subject to death. It's very similar to that meditation that we had in the five remembrances, but we get death is certain for me. Then we go back to single pointed focus, and we single pointedly focus on that thought. Death is certain. It's going to happen to me. It's going to happen to me. And then when it begins to get a little, weaker, then we go back to the analysis and we recharge it, and then we go back to the stabilizing. This is how we actually change our minds, is using these two forces of meditation together, stabilizing to begin with, and analyzing till we get to the conclusion, and then we unite it with the stabilizing again. But we're stabilizing on that. We're not stabilizing on the breath at that point. Then when it weakens, we go back to analysis to strengthen it again. And then once more, when you get to the conclusion, bring it back to stabilizing. Again, this is a technique that anyone can use. This is taught in Buddhism, but I think that's, and we see a lot of contemplative traditions outside of Buddhism that could use similar ability to understand and get to know things on an intimate level, requires some stability of mind, and also requires that we analyze them correctly. So, all right. That's just a little advice on meditating on these, because again, this is really the main meditation we use in Tibetan Buddhism to deal with the reality of death. Now, to deal with the reality of the uncertain time of death, we have three more reasons that are given here. Again, as I said, Lama Tsongkhapa says this is really the main meditation, the most important meditation in the death awareness meditation, because we have to get that death can happen at any time, that it's absolutely uncertain. We like to think, again, that we have quite a long stretch of time out ahead of us, and many of us will have that, but there's no guarantee. Number 4, the lifespan of beings in this world isn't certain. Now, in Buddhism, they do teach that there are certain realms where human beings have a fixed lifespan. That sounds kind of outrageous, like, you would have some hundreds of years where you would be living. I'm not so sure. Again, would we want that or not? But they say that's not a great impetus to meditating on death, because if we think that our death is some hundreds of years out in the future, it's not much impetus to practice, perhaps, because it's uncertain in this world. Because you can, again, look at the obituaries and you see people die at all ages. Yes, maybe the larger portion in the obituaries are folks that are in the upper years, the upper decades, because that is the general thing that happens. But you can see people at all different ages dying. People who are teenagers die. People who are young adults die. People who are children die. People who are infants die. Of course, some beings die in the womb. They might have a miscarriage, and that being never even comes out of the womb to have, that human life. There is no fixed age at which people die in this realm that we're living in. Again, it might be something that everybody knows at some level, but you have to bring it home for you. You have to recall that this is an indicator that you're not immune to death at the age that you're at. We're all at different ages here. I don't think any of us are exactly the same age, perhaps, but wherever we are at in that continuum of our aging process, we're not immune to death, because death can happen at any time. I think this is very, maybe more powerful for younger folks, perhaps, but I think any of us can benefit from that type of meditation, where we just look at the reality that there's not a guarantee of even another day, because death could happen for any one of us. I think, again, when we dealt with the pandemic, that came home to some degree, right? Because many of you know people who died in the pandemic, or maybe have relatives of a friend who died, or, people that kind of in our, not maybe immediate circle, but we're aware of them. And certainly if you're watching the news or anything during the pandemic, it was horrific, the amount of people who were dying. But we live with that every day. We just saw it more clearly, perhaps, in the pandemic, that people were dying at all different ages and all different physical constitutions, right? We had some people who were amazing athletes and dancers and what have you, that had this great vitality in their life, but they succumbed to the virus in the same way that other people did as well. Those are also things we can think about, is that whatever our condition is, you might think, oh, I'm really healthy. I don't have to worry about death. Healthy people die all the time. I'm really young. I don't have to worry about death. Young people die all the time. Again, we have to say that that's not the majority of the people who are dying in any particular day, but the fact that they're there precludes us from thinking that they can't be there. And that's the mind state that we have. And we think that in particular with regard to ourselves, whatever age we're at, we think, well, it's not going to happen today. Whole gist of these meditations is to get us to that place that Rinpoche wants us to be at, where we think today is the day I'm going to die, and one day we're going to be right. One day that day is going to be our death day. Number 5, there are more factors conducive to death than there are actually to life. Now, I don't want to get into a debate on this because I think I might end up losing the debate, but what they say is if we really look at all the things involved in our world, we have to actually spend quite a bit of time and energy to continue to live. And there are actually quite a few things out there that could be the cause of our death. It's again a proposition that we might have to investigate a little bit, but the way that they encourage you to investigate this is through examining in particular 3 things that can be the cause of your death. Not 3 very specific things, but categories of things that can be involved in your death. The first is the external conditions that can happen, right? And we know that from, living in this world that has dangerous things around us. It has cars on the road, going a zillion miles an hour, and it's got airplanes we get on, and it's got all of these things that can happen that are outside of us, the elements. Look at what's going on in our world with change in climate. Many people, I'm sure, even when they were preparing for the storms that went through North Carolina and Florida and what have you, they were not thinking that they were going to die. And yet they did die because those floodwaters and hurricanes and tornadoes, even in Florida, when the hurricane hit the last one, Milton, all of these things became the cause of death. There are many external factors that can cause your death. It's even like, space junk, doesn't land on most of us because the larger part of this planet is water, and a lot of things land in the water, but, meteors come down out of the sky, right? It does happen. I'm not trying to, again, this meditation isn't meant to freak you out so that you never leave your house, because we're going to get to that. Sometimes even when you're in your house, you die from something in your house, right? So don't think you can escape this reality, but also don't get freaked out by it to where you think, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Death is all around me. It's just to wake us up to the reality that we think we're pretty impervious and death is not going to happen. At least in that day. We might have an idea again that it's going to happen sometime later, but we have to bring that in and say, yes, and it could happen today because there are actually many causes. The first one being these external things that can happen, that we can suddenly have total change in our experience. I remember the one TV show I really like to watch, and it's actually a good meditation on death, and parts of it is 6 Feet Under, this show about a family that was running a funeral home in Los Angeles. Every show started out with at least one death. I think there was one episode that was called Death Works Overtime, where they had 3 deaths at the beginning. But whoever dies generally was the body that they would bring into the mortuary in order to prep it and have the funeral and what have you. But it was interesting because, of course, every one of them died in many different ways and was different ages and different races and different, whatever, all across the board. And so you had like one elderly Asian man who was like pushing his uh, trash out to the side of the road where, they were going to come pick it up, and he just collapsed on the way of doing that. There was another woman who was at home eating dinner by herself. She had her whole meal out there and everything with a glass of water, and she starts choking on the food, goes to get her glass of water, and it tips over, and she doesn't have the water, and they keep the camera there on her food, and you hear her going to the kitchen and fumbling with trying to get water out of the faucet and dying on the kitchen floor. Again, might freak you out when you think about that happening to you, but it's not to freak you out. It's to make you aware that we think that this is how we're going to live our lives with some sort of Teflon coating, and death is never going to fall on us. We're going to be able to resist it and avoid it. But it can come for us, especially through these external causes. The second one is internal causes. We have a lot of things within our own bodies that can go wrong. I remember there's a commercial that's about like blood clots or something. They say something smaller than the point of a needle can actually cause your death, because the small blood clot can become larger and get in your heart or whatever. Again, I'm not trying to freak people out by these things. So you can avoid, and if you can avoid some things that would cause your death, why not? Sure. Once more, look at your motivation. But there are many causes within our own bodies of our own death. We even have, um, you know, organs that can malfunction. We have cancers that can grow in the body and so on. These are all things that can happen with these human bodies that we have. So we have to think about that reality. Many things within our own bodies that will fail or that will become diseased or that will in some way be a cause of our death. The third thing is that even some of the things that sustain our lives can be the cause of our death. I remember a few years back when it was actually from California, there was a lot of spinach or, I can't remember, spinach or lettuce of some sort, some greens that were infected with E. coli. And it was organic food as well. I mean, a lot of us might eat organic food thinking we're doing such a wonderful thing to our bodies by eating things that are not polluted by pesticides and what have you. But the E. coli can still be there. I mean, again, not trying to freak you out, just trying to make you aware that even things that we do to sustain this body, to sustain our lives by eating food or taking medicines, they can be the cause of our death. Even the houses that we live in, going back to that, you might think, oh, I'm just going to shut myself in the house and have all my food delivered and make sure I inspect it really well and wash it really well and do everything I can to avoid all these causes of death. Well, sometimes houses collapse. I mean, here we are in California, right? With earthquakes. You might be in your house thinking I'm completely safe, and then suddenly the roof's coming down on you. So a lot of things that we look to for safety or for maintaining this life, protecting this life, might even become the cause of our death. I mean, there are cases where because somebody's wearing a seatbelt, they actually die from the seatbelt. It generally saves lives by keeping the body from flying, up with the car and getting battered all around in the car while it's rolling over or whatever. But there are cases where actually something that is intended to protect and save life can cause our death. So these three things, external, internal, even those things that sustain our lives or protect our lives can be the cause of our death, should make us aware that there are many things out there that could potentially cause our death. Yeah, maybe we avoid the things that are more dangerous, make sure that we don't do things like, you know, skydiving without a parachute or something. Not a good idea. But we do what we can to keep that awareness that it's uncertain when death could come, and one of these factors could come into your life and suddenly be the cause of your death. Okay, so that's nice, healthy little meditation. And I think we're pretty much at the end of our time. I'll just mention this. We'll go into this in the morning. Our bodies are very fragile. It's kind of a continuation of some of what we looked at, but it's also getting the understanding that we think this body is quite resilient. But in fact, as I pointed out earlier, even very healthy bodies can sometimes fall prey to causes of death. So I'm going to jump to the conclusion just so we could get that in before. And as I said, I'll go over this a little bit more tomorrow. But if you want to meditate on any of what we talked about today, the continuance of those remembrances, going through the 5 remembrances, going through the first point that death is certain, going through the second main point that the time of death is uncertain, you have at least some information to work with. Because the conclusion we come to is, having looked at all of that and seen that our death is uncertain as to when it will come, well then, not only must we practice Dharma, but as it says on the screen, I'll put it, we have to practice it now. We can't wait. Because we may not get another day. Every one of us likes to think that we have many, many more days in this life. And how wonderful if that is the case. But no guarantees. Absolutely no guarantees. So we must practice it now. We must make sure that we use this day, this moment, this time. That's why Lama Zopa says, have that thought every day. This is my last day. Even if you think, again, this could be my last day, that's already very powerful. But if you think this is my last day, well, then what are you going to do with this day? Are you going to binge watch on Netflix or something? Or are you going to, go out and party all day? Or mean, there might be some people who say that is their response. If they think it's their last day, they'd rather just party all day. But is that the best use of this life? Again, with the knowledge that what goes on from this life is what we've done with our minds, you know, I'd do something different. Any questions or comments on today and what we talked about more specifically, this last part? Good reminders. Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of you have heard these teachings before, and so I'm kind of preaching to the converted in a sense, but at the same time, you know, how much do we really get these? Do we really live from that place? Because we can see how frequently our mind just goes to, as we make plans for the future, as we do all this thinking, oh, I'm going to be around then and I'm going to do these things then. One little reflection they say is if, you know, you think, okay, how much energy and time do I put into planning a vacation, for example? Say I'm going to go to Paris or whatever. Well, how much time and energy do I put into making that a reality? And that is uncertain as to whether it's even going to happen or not, right? Because we could die before then. How much time do we put into preparing for our death, on the other hand? Making sure that we are ready for that moment, that we've done what we can with this life. It's very clear that we sometimes have the wrong mind and think that we're going to keep putting our faith in future experiences in this life, and there's no guarantee. Okay. Okay. Yeah, Bay is going to have a question or make a comment, getting the microphone. So, okay.
Okay. It's my, not sure if it's a question. It's not quite well formed, but um, like all of these things that you've gone through,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's familiar, and even though I, you know, um, do the contemplation a lot, but when there's some sort of sickness or medical diagnosis, say, even with me or a family member, someone's, you know, loved one, then there's this, the feeling is quite different. It's like it hits home, but it's so strong,
Yeah.
you know. Um, and it makes me feel like, okay, maybe all of my contemplation wasn't strong enough, because I could see how when it becomes real, it's
Mhm.
it's quite um, different, you know.
Sure.
So
Yeah. No, and I can appreciate that because I think we all have that experience where we go, okay, I've meditated on this topic. I've done a fair amount of time contemplating death and feel like I've maybe gotten more accepting of the reality of it, of the uncertainty of the time of it and everything. And yet, it's almost like the haiku. You know, it is hard to change our minds to a place where we have that full acceptance of that reality and an ability to be okay with that in a sense. And once more, I think we do have to differentiate some of the kind of concern that we have for the suffering of the world that is a bit of that haiku that I mentioned as well, you know, that we can have the understanding at some level, but it's also still good to have something register in terms of when we do encounter death. Certainly when we encounter things with others, if you have loved ones in your life who are receiving a diagnosis or something that looks more challenging for them, to recognize that there's a sadness that's going to come up in that, and some resistance to wanting to fully accept all of that. That is maybe part of a healthy response to the suffering of the world. It's not necessarily something that we can be completely free of in that regard. What we want to be free of once more, though, is the delusion that this isn't going to happen to us and to others. You know, to be able to accept the reality of death and yet still be very moved by what we see in terms of, because I don't think it's meant to make us really callous about death. Like when you watch the news and you see all of these dead bodies that are being carted out of the rubble in Gaza or something, that you just go, oh, you know, that's death. Death happens and, you know, nothing you can do about it. I think it's meant to once more still have an emotional kind of content that is there in regard to it, but to still have the acceptance that that is the reality, that every being is going to have to face that. So it's tricky. And maybe we do still need to improve our meditation on death and have it hit home. We're going to do a little exercise. I debated whether I should do this, and I'll do this tomorrow. that really does maybe bring some of this home in terms of how accepting are we of the reality of death. Not to say that we won't still have some emotional content, but to what degree can we um, accept that this is going to happen to us? Anyway, I debated on it, but I think I will be sharing that tomorrow. I got it from Lenny Kronish, who I think has done some things here and other centers in the Bay Area. It's a little meditation on what steps might be preceding your actually, going out of this world. And I won't give you more information than that. We'll just do it tomorrow. But yeah, I think that there's something to be said for the fact that we may not feel like we're fully prepared, but nonetheless, maybe we actually do have some deeper acceptance of it. It still just is hard. There's still hardness to that, to seeing that. I don't know. I don't want to I don't want to be too hard on ourselves either, because once more, this is a process that we're all trying to engage in, trying to be more accepting. It. The biggest determinant, once more, is to what degree are we using this life meaningfully? That's the degree to which it has probably hit home. Are we practicing the Dharma now? Are we practicing it with great energy and enthusiasm? And if you're doing that, it can be very much coming from this, whether or not you feel like you've got it when things change in your life or things become challenging and you have to confront issues around death and mortality. Because I think those are still always going to have some hardness to them, some difficulty to them. You think about it more, though. It's a good question. Anyone else? Anything before we conclude? About 5 minutes over. All right, let's have some dedicating thoughts to conclude today. As we did last night, we can first dedicate for our own development of this awareness of the preciousness of this life and the importance of using it very well, and our need to, as I've been saying, prepare for death accordingly, to be ready for when that happens, so that we can have a most fruitful process of death, and of course, a good continuity of our minds into good existences beyond this life. And may we proceed from life to life and eventually attain the culmination of our own potential, our full development into the state of Buddhahood, so we can then benefit all sentient beings, help them to have some acceptance around death and loss, help them to have realizations on the path, and help them to eventually attain that same state. We also dedicate for the good health and long lives of our precious teachers, especially His Holiness the Dalai Lama, this guiding force in our world that we need so badly as we continue to deal with so many difficulties on our planet. Also for the good health and long lives other gurus, also for the very swift return of our own guru and spiritual director, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, that he may return in a form to be able to benefit all of us and all beings in this world. And we also dedicate for those beings that we're holding in our hearts right now. Maybe we do have beings in our lives whose situation moves us, who are dealing with great difficulty, perhaps even dealing with death or loss in their lives. We send this positive energy out to these beings that we're thinking about right now, and giving it all to them so they can be free from their suffering and have all the causes that will lead them to true happiness. And really feel like you're giving this to them. It's having this very positive effect on their state. And then we dedicate finally by saying, and may all beings have the same results of complete freedom from all their suffering and dissatisfaction, and the complete attainment of their ultimate peaceful state of well-being. Okay, thank you all. Thanks for all of the kind support online and here in the Gompa.